to fluid management. What can we do with an ultrasound? So we can assess fluid status, evaluate for shock, look for pneumothorax, pneumonia, and insert central lines and perform tracheostomy and evaluate for ICU acquired weakness. So how do I use ultrasound for assessing fluid status and for evaluating shock? So the first question which we should be answering is why assess fluid status? So hypovolemia or shock is bothersome because it leads to circulatory failure and its attendant consequences, which is acidosis, lactic acidosis, and poor tissue perfusion. So we generally get hold of these investigations in the ICU, the lactate level, the pH, and other metabolic endpoints. But by the time we obtain these parameters to be abnormal, the most useful time and the narrow window which we have to save the patient is lost. So there are early points where one needs to identify patients who are at risk. So one is the cardiac output measurement, the second is the stroke volume measurement, and third is the preload. The gold standard for all these would be cardiac output measurement by invasive arterial catheters, PICO, LITCO, and the FlowTrack system, which are recently available. These are the two places where ultrasound can help at the bedside. The first is the preload assessment, and the second is the cardiac output assessment, which we'll be seeing subsequently. So not all patients respond to fluid similarly. Here I'm showing the Frank-Starling curve. To the x-axis, you see the left ventricular end diastolic pressure, which in turn is determined by the preload of the heart. So with an increasing in a preload and the left ventricular end diastolic pressure, the cardiac output increases. But it would be different in patient with decreased contractility and normal contractility. So among the tools which we have to assess the fluid responsiveness, we can have the pulmonary artery catheter, which is more invasive and has not been shown to be much useful. The commonly used central venous pressure monitoring and the point of care ultrasound and echocardiography. So the first and the commonly available central venous pressure monitoring. It's a useful marker of right ventricular function. However, as a predictor of fluid responsiveness, it fares poorly. It has an AU ROC of 0.56 to indicate a fluid responsiveness. In a simple term, you can assess the fluid by tossing a coin or by measuring the CVP and deciding whether the patient is going to respond to a fluid challenge or not. But yet, CVP is commonly used because it's easily available, quickly placed, and it does give some vital clues. So how do we use it in our practice? A high CVP may not be a true reflector of the fluid status. However, a low CVP, say less than 5 centimeter of saline, suggests a fluid deficit and may guide fluid management to a certain extent. And additionally, once the fluid is repleted, we can use this to provide infusion and administer vasopressors. So in this video, to the top, we are seeing two modalities by which we use ultrasound to guide central line placement. So the left image indicates the horizontal placement. Here we can see the compressible structure, which is the IVC. We can see on the horizontal axis and used to guide central vein placement. The other one is inline or the vertical placement of the ultrasound probe. So this is useful because it guides the real-time guidance and it is less likely to be fraught with complication. The third kind of ultrasound used for placing central line is an oblong view of placing the central line, which is in between these two, not horizontal, not vertical. In between, we get the best of the both worlds. So it guides the real-time placement as well as it does not place the site of entry too close to the ear or the cheek, where suturing would be difficult. So the next point of care ultrasound to assess the fluid status. So when we are assessing a patient with shock, we are interested in two things. Is the fluid status adequate? Is the pump functioning okay? The first component is fluid assessment. We can assess by static measure, that is how much is the IVC diameter. Second, with every breath, how much does the IVC collapse or distend? The next part of it is pump assessment. Is the heart responding adequately to a fluid challenge? that is fluid responsiveness, or is the heart working properly? Is the LV okay? Is the pericardium having a fluid, or there is an RV dysfunction? So this is the tool which we have at bedside. This is a commonly available ultrasound machine of the Sonosite which we have at our ICU as well. The probe on the extreme right, or this is the one which we use for the ultrasound of the abdomen. It can be used for IVC visualization as well. The middle one is the echo probe, both to assess the heart, and IVC can also be alternatively assessed with this. And the third is the superficial probe, which can be used to assess superficial structures 6 to 13 megahertz, and it can be used for pleural and lung ultrasound. So how do we assess the fluid status? First is the placement of the probe. So this probe needs to be placed in the epigastrium, just below the xiphisternum. So once we place it here, we are likely to encounter a linear structure on the ultrasound, which would be the aorta, and towards the right, on the side of the liver, we would expect the IVC. So the measurements are generally taken 1 to 2 centimeter below the hepatic vein IVC junction, or 3 to 4 centimeter below the right atrium. So this is the view which would be expecting once the probe is in the right position. Towards the left corner is the right atrium. Draining into the right atrium is the inferior vena cava, and this is the hepatic vein draining into the IVC. So we should measure 1 to 2 centimeter below this junction here, or 3 to 4 centimeter below the right atrium. So once we decide where we are supposed to measure, we can place the M mode and freeze the image. So here we can measure this anechoic tubular structure is the IVC, and we can measure with the calipers the diameter of the IVC. Here at 2 points it has been measured. At point A, the caliper shows 1.95 centimeter and 2 centimeter at a different point. So before we go on to the interpretation of it, we need to know that IVC measurement, though it reflects the fluid status, it is not a gold standard, since several other parameters measure it. So like we have seen in the previous structures, it depends on the RA, the abdominal structures, and the thoracic structures. So IVC measurement can be modified if there is a RV disease, tricuspid valve disease, obstructed right atrium, and to the gastroenterologist's interest, if there is a portosystemic shunting, the IVC may be empty since the blood would have been drained through alternate routes. And extraluminal factors. The most important among the extraluminal factors is the status of the thoracic cavity. A tension pneumothorax would increase the intrathoracic pressure and falsely distend the IVC. And the status of ventilation, be it mechanical or spontaneous, determines whether the IVC is going to be distended or collapse. And more importantly, in the setting of tense ascites or edema due to fluid overload, the IVC may be falsely collapsed because of external pressure from raised intra-abdominal pressure. Apart from these factors, obese patient, poor visualization of IVC, inter-observer variability needs to be considered before we interpret IVC diameters. And a note on how the studies have been done. I'm not going into the details of the studies. These are studies where IVC diameter has been compared, whether fluid responsiveness was present or not. What I need you to note is that most of these patients were on mechanical ventilation with a tidal volume of 8 to 10 ml per kg and in a controlled mode of ventilation. So we should exercise caution before we interpret this to a spontaneously breathing patient which we encounter in an emergency or in your endoscopy room. So the IVC measurement can be static or dynamic. The static measurement is the absolute diameter of the IVC. A diameter less than 1 centimeter or 10 mm probably indicates a fluid deficit and the patient is likely to be fluid responsive. And a diameter of more than 2 or 2.5 centimeter means that the patient is already fluid replete and the fluid is unlikely to help. A more useful parameter is the dynamic measurement. Dynamic by mean that with respiration, the diameter of the IVC. So in this image of M mode, the linear anechoic structure represents the IVC. When the patient is having sufficient fluid, the IVC does not collapse. Between point A and point B, the diameter varies between 1.9 centimeter and 2 centimeter, which is hardly anything. And to the right, we have another image where the IVC diameter is about 2 centimeter here. And during an inspiration, it has collapsed fully, showing that the patient may have a fluid responsive status. So here in this image, this is the contracting heart. This linear anechoic structure is the IVC, and this is the hepatic vein. We see that with each breath, the variation of the IVC diameter is not much. Though there is variation, it's not much. On the left, we see that there is a contracting heart and the venous chamber completely collapses with each breath. So on the left, you would expect the patient to be fluid responsive. So this is another similar image. This is the liver, I think you would be able to appreciate. And this is the hepatic vein, which is draining into the IVC. Here, the variation with each breath is not much. So the fluid patient may not be fluid responsive. So once we have decided where we are supposed to measure, we can freeze the image with this, and calipers can be used to measure the points A or B. These are two measurements, one during inspiration and the other during expiration. So to see whether the IVC collapses with breath or not. So this is done using the M mode. So the next, moving on to how the pump works. So this is for advanced users, but it is good to have an idea of how this works. So once we do the echocardiography, we can, this is the LV outflow tract. So at the LV outflow tract, we can measure the diameter and the speed at which the blood flows through it. Indirectly, it is represented by this formula. The cardiac output is a measure of stroke volume and a heart rate. The stroke volume can be obtained from the echocardiography by two parameters: the diameter of the aortic valve and the VTI, or the velocity time integral. So both can be obtained by echocardiography. So once we place the echo probe in the LVOT view, we can find this velocity time integral, which is available in centimeter, and the diameter of the aortic valve will also be available. So we can indicate, find the cardiac output, and after fluid challenge, we can see whether the cardiac output increases or not. So the other clues would be, say if the patient is in shock, this is a forced chamber view of the heart and the heart barely moves. So indicating LV dysfunction as a possible cause of shock. Second, when we are viewing the venous and arterial structure, the venous structure in the neck may be fully collapsing. So the lung ultrasound. Two features are important when we assess lung ultrasound for shock. The first is the pneumothorax and the second is the presence of B lines. So to be methodical, we can use several protocols which are available. The simple one is the 6-point examination. 2 in the front, 1 at the back, both sides, right and the left. So 6 points can be examined using this superficial structures high frequency probe. So this presents the normal lung ultrasound. The black area of the anechoic one is the rib shadow, which is black, and this white line represents the pleura. So in a normal pleura, we will have the sliding. This is normal, and this is how we expect a normal lung to be. So in a normal pleura, if we freeze and go to the M mode, we'll find this seashore sign. This is the pleural line, and this is the normal lung parenchyma. So when somebody is having a pneumothorax, the pleura doesn't slide anymore. This is called as an absent sliding sign. The presence of sliding sign, which is an artifact, indicates that the absence of a pneumothorax. So when we put an M mode, we'll find the stratosphere sign or the barcode sign, in contrast to the normal seashore sign. So the B lines are important clues. After you have fluid resuscitated, this can be handy. So this is the pleura, this is a white line, and the vertical line, just like the disco lights, what you're seeing, the linear lines, which are like comet tails, which extend up to the visualized field of the ultrasound view. This appearance of B lines indicates presence of some fluid droplets, which may increase the refractoriness and suggest pulmonary edema. So finally, how can a point of care ultrasound be useful in shock? First is the placement of a central line and a real-time guidance. Second, static parameter of IVC. Third, IVC collapsibility. and an absolute cardiac estimation in predicting fluid responsiveness. And once the resuscitation is done, we can see whether fluid excess has been there by seeing the B lines, and we can also exclude pneumothorax, pericardial effusion, and LV dysfunction. So it's a useful modality in critically ill patients, and it aids our clinical judgment. And dynamic scales are more useful than static ones. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah. The audience is invited for any questions if they have about this. Dr. Valipan, you can also visualize the sagittal section of the left ventricle through the transgastric route?
Yes, sir.
That will tell you about the left ventricular filling to an extent when you are looking at absolute fluid deficit.
Yes, sir. So I had skipped the slide on the kissing papillary sign. So basically, if we can see the left ventricle, if it is empty, the papillary muscles which are in the inner part of the heart will come close and oppose each other, indicating that the heart is empty. It's a direct visualization that the heart is empty, and a fluid resuscitation might help the patient.
Among clinical examination, which one would be the best predictor of fluid responsiveness? Like we normally use leg raising test, which so what is the sensitivity of it compared to the more objective assessments?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, the passive leg raising test is one of the simplest and one of the reliable tests, even more than all other parameters which have been discussed. Passive leg raise test works by a fluid challenge. So by raising the legs by 45 degree, you give a fluid challenge of 300 ml. And if the stroke volume variation of more than 12% or 15% occurs, it indicates that the patient is likely to be fluid responsive. So the sensitivity is more than 70% and the specificity is also above 85 to 90%. So it's a good test, even more than all these things. But the problem with this, you cannot do it in your routine beds. If a dedicated bed will be useful, because when you are evaluating someone by the PLR, if you stimulate his adrenergic system, say if the patient becomes triggered or becomes agitated, the heart the sympathetic system will be active, and you may be falsely seeing a rise in cardiac output and the change in the parameters which you are measuring. So, but when done properly, PLR is a very good test among the clinical tests, which is simple and useful. So, yes.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Sir, my question is regarding the PEEP when you measure the CVP. So there is a lot of conflicting data. Some people ask you to minus the PEEP. Some people tell that there is no bearing of PEEP on CVP. So what's your take on it?
It's only physiological studies which have suggested this. The PEEP is generally given in ARDS patient where the compliance is poor. So when a high PEEP is given in an ARDS patient, it is believed that the pressure will be transmitted to the right atrium because of the poor compliance. And they suggest that 1/2 to 2/3 of the measured CVP should be taken as the correct value. Yes, it is going to affect, but to how much effect and to what extent we should reduce is controversial. So people recommend somewhere between 1/2 to 2/3 of correction for the PEEP. So basically the CVP and the IVC measurement, all these depend on the mechanical interaction between the heart and lung. So if the intrathoracic pressure is high, it will exert its force on the pliable heart chambers, which is the right side of the heart. If it is fully compressed, the CVP is likely to be distended, sometimes falsely, or the IVC is also sometimes falsely distended. Any more additions, sir?
Yeah, I would say that since we know that the use of CVP for fluid responsiveness has almost completely gone out of vogue. We don't use it at all. But most of the time we look at the dynamic measures like the IVC collapsibility or distensibility, or the actual look at the left ventricular filling, rather than any of these static measurements.
Yes, sir. Actually, CVP, as I told you, it's just as good as tossing a coin and deciding whether the patient is going to be fluid responsive or not. But it can be useful if it is very low and it is almost empty. That is one situation where if you place a central line and you find it to be 0 or 1 or 2, maybe that is one place that can be really useful. An elevated or a normal CVP is unlikely to be helpful in patients, especially if they are critically ill.
Yeah, I have two questions for you, Valliyappan. One question is that is there a non-invasive way of using any of the ultrasound Doppler characteristics to tell you what is the CVP measurement? That's one. Second question is there a combination of two things like IVC diameter, collapsibility plus the lung parameters? Is there a combination of two tests which can improve your sensitivity and accuracy in picking up fluid overload state versus a fluid responsive state?
So it is a composite assessment. So coming to the first question, I'm not aware of Doppler as a surrogate for CVP measurement. However, vessels other than IVC have also been targeted for this collapsibility and variability. SVC has been sometimes in patients whom IVC cannot be visualized. SVC measurement and the neck veins and even the femoral veins have been used for the collapsibility index. That is an alternative if the veins IVC cannot be visualized. And coming to the second question, a combination is useful in the clinical judgment, but they have not been evaluated in clinical trials as a bundled approach, though recent trials are looking into whether visualizing lung B lines avoids patients going into cardiac failure. So if they have designed a study where 28 points, the B lines will be measured and the patient will be fluid resuscitated. If more than 15 score is achieved with the B line measurement, it indicates that the patient is likely to have a fluid excess and better keep him dry. And if he has low, then you continue with the fluid management. So rather than relying on a single parameter, a composite judgment, including the clinical parameters, will be more useful. So as I said, even the IVC can be fallacious. If it is, say, ascites and an intra-abdominal pressure, we might be fallaciously labeling the IVC to be collapsed in an already fluid overloaded patient.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valliyappan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valliyappan, for a wonderful talk. Now we go on to the second talk in this session on ICU issues. This will be a talk on parenteral nutrition, which will be taken by Professor Anup Saraya. Professor Saraya is the Chief of Department of Gastroenterology at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And he's very well known for his work on pancreatic diseases, nutritional issues, and social medicine. Over to you, sir.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my views today. I'll be speaking on parenteral nutrition, when to give, and how to monitor. So the outline will be to assess nutritional risk, then indication for parenteral nutrition, contraindications, parenteral prescription, how to write a prescription, how to monitor, and what are the complications associated with it. So nutritional risk is defined by the present nutritional status and risk of impairment of present status due to increased requirement caused by stress metabolism of the clinical condition. So there are various tools. So these tools are important, especially to assess nutritional status in ICU. One is NRS 2002. So we make an initial screening based on 4 parameters, that is BMI, weight loss within 3 months, reduced dietary intake last week, and ICU patient. Any patient in ICU for more than 48 hours is at nutritional risk. So if anyone is positive, then we go for final screening. And in this, we take into account the nutritional impairment, and based on that, it can be categorized into mild, moderate, or severe. And severity of disease is also taken into account. And we assign a score to each of this, and the sum total, if it is more than 3, then we say that patient is definitely at a nutritional risk. Then there are certain new indices, like Nutric score, which is especially designed for critically ill patient in ICU, and it correlates with mortality and identify critically ill patient most likely to benefit from aggressive therapy. So these are the 6 parameters taken into account: age, Apache 2, SOFA, number of comorbidities, days from hospital to ICU admission, and based on the ranges, we assign particular points. So if the total is more than 5, excluding IL-6, or if it including IL-6 is more than 6, then we say the patient is at high nutritional risk. This is very important because there are patients, those who are not at risk initially, but during ICU stay, they may develop risk during hospitalization, and there are patients with chronic disease. They are at risk, so we have to decide beforehand how much nutrition is to be given, because otherwise they will end up with repeat syndrome. So options are enteral nutrition and parenteral nutrition. As we know, enteral nutrition is always preferred if it is possible to give. So I was told to prepare a few questions also in between. So this is my first question on the screen. Any answer? Which of the following contraindication for enteral nutrition?
Yes, Dr. Daya. Any answers for this?
If none, then no problem. I'll come to the next slide.
Severe acute pancreatitis.
Yes, you're right. So when we have to avoid an enteral nutrition, if there is uncontrolled shock, hemodynamic and tissue perfusion goals are not met, uncontrolled hypoxemia, I'm saying uncontrolled hypoxemia, hypercapnia or acidosis, active upper GI bleed, this is also relative at times, overt bowel ischemia, bowel trauma, intestinal obstruction, high output intestinal fistula, if reliable feeding access distal to fistula is not achievable, abdominal compartment syndrome, and if gastric aspirate volume is above 500 ml in 6 hours. So these are the conditions in which we say that patient is probably having intestinal failure, and how this intestinal failure is defined: the reduction of gut function below the minimum necessary for the absorption of macronutrients and of water and electrolyte, such that intravenous supplementation is required to maintain health and growth. So this failure can be classified as type 1, type 2, or type 3 on the basis of whether it is short-term, acute, and often self-limiting, that is type 1. Usual examples are perioperative setting, abdominal surgery, and critical illness. And here the duration of PN required is in days to weeks. In type 2, there is prolonged acute condition causing metabolically unstable patients, like intra-abdominal catastrophe, like mesenteric ischemia, valvular trauma with massive enterectomy. And here nutrition is required for weeks to months. And type 3, when there are the chronic conditions, patient is metabolically stable, like short bowel syndrome, radiation enteritis, or malignancy. Here, duration of parenteral nutrition required is in months to years. So this is the second question. A case of alcohol-related moderate to severe acute pancreatitis, day 16. With pain for last 8 days, he can meet only 30% of energy requirement with enteral nutrition. What is the next step for nutrition? Any answer?
Yes, Dr. Winkle.
So we should continue enteral nutrition, whatever amount he can tolerate, plus supplementary parenteral nutrition.
Yes, right. So what is supplementary parenteral nutrition? For the patient already on enteral nutrition for 7 days to 10 days, and then unable to meet more than 60% of energy need and of protein requirement by enteral food. So then supplementary parenteral nutrition has a role. And in critical illness, there are few studies, very important studies, where early versus late parenteral nutrition was compared. It's a large series published in New England Journal of Medicine from Belgium, multicentric trial with late initiation group and early initiation group. And what we have observed that in ICU patient with an absolute contraindication to enteral nutrition who were started on parenteral nutrition on day 3 were less likely to be discharged alive than those on day in which parenteral nutrition was started on day 8. Therefore, parenteral nutrition should be withheld for the first 7 days in patient at low nutrition risk. This is the recommendation after this study. And as far as supplemental parenteral nutrition in critically ill patient is concerned, here also, this was a very good study published in Lancet in 2013, where supplemental parenteral nutrition, when given, then what happened? After 4 days in the ICU, they reduced the number of nosocomial infections were less in the patient with supplemental parenteral nutrition as compared to enteral nutrition. So now comparing enteral versus parenteral nutrition, there are multiple randomized controlled trial and many meta-analysis, and there one thing is uniformly coming out from all these analyses that there is no effect on overall mortality, but infectious complications are higher in parenteral group with higher calorie intake, while no difference where enteral and parenteral group have a similar calorie. So how to initiate parenteral nutrition? We first make a assessment, nutritional risk assessment, and then we look for contraindication, which I have already listed in the previous slide. If there are no contraindication, within 48 hours, we initiate enteral nutrition. And if there is severe malnutrition or high nutrition score, then we wait for 7 days and initiate parenteral nutrition. If this is high, then initiate parenteral nutrition and reassess gut function daily and trial. Then you see, the moment patient is in a position to start or to tolerate enteral nutrition, we start enteral nutrition at the earliest. So in surgical patients, a patient with malnutrition and those at nutritional risk, in the perioperative nutritional therapy, this is the indication. When we anticipate that patient will be unable to eat for more than 5 days perioperatively, there also we initiate nutrition. Expected to have low oral intake and who cannot maintain about 50% of recommended intake for more than 70 days, then also we give nutrition. So PNN preoperative patient, if the energy and nutrient requirement cannot be met by oral and enteral intake alone, for more than 7 days, a combination of enteral and parenteral nutrition is recommended, and parenteral nutrition should be administered as soon as possible if nutrition therapy is indicated and there is no contraindication for enteral nutrition. Parenteral nutrition in post-operative patients, gastrointestinal fistula, high output fistula, post-operative mechanical bar obstruction, and delayed gastric emptying with no access to jejunal feed or refractory Tylus leak. These are the indication for post-operative patients. What are the contraindications? There are certain absolute contraindications like enteral feeding possible, and anticipated duration of fasting is less than 5 days in patient at low nutritional risk. So these are absolute contraindication, and relative is when shock is present, catheter-related infection, lactic acidosis and contraction alkalosis, severe electrolyte disturbances, and refeeding syndrome or volume overload. Parenteral nutrition is that prescription, how we write a prescription, and then first we decide the composition and then we decide on route of administration. So a multidisciplinary team is required, an experienced clinician, dietitian, pharmacist, and nurses. And the prescription is we give carbohydrate, proteins in amino acid or fat, like intravenous lipid emulsion, electrolytes, mineral, vitamins, trace elements. It should be individualized. And there is this permanent, the parenteral nutrition which is available in the market, they are 3-in-1 or total nutritional admixture or 2-in-1 formulation. Total nutritional admixture has an advantage because it has safety, low risk of infection, and convenience also. And standardized premix formulations are commercially available. For ease of calculation, most standard parenteral nutrition solution contains approximately 1 calorie per ml, and usual contribution of the non-protein calories, carbohydrate 70% to 85%, fat 15 to 30%. The distribution may be adjusted based on tolerance and to minimize potential immune suppressive effect of soya oil. Which of the following usually a constant of total nutrition admixture 3-in-1 parenteral nutrition?
Dr. Sachin?
Any idea? Answer is complex carbohydrate. These are the formulation you have seen. These are specs which are available. So how we write a prescription in a 70 kg bag? Add protein 1.2 gram per day to the mixture. 85 grams of protein is needed. Add lipid as 1 to 1.5 gram per kg per day, and carbohydrate 3 to 5 grams per kg per day. Then make the total volume 30 ml per kg, and we can add electrolytes, minerals, vitamins, and other things as well. So macronutrient and micronutrients which are needed, this is the normal requirement. You all know, we can skip this slide. And MVI composition that contains almost all the vitamins except B12. These are the trace elements which can be given, and like cell, this is a preparation which is available, which contains chromium, copper, manganese, zinc, and selenium. These are important because selenium, zinc, means especially manganese and phosphate. In fact, these all are needed in microgram. Their requirement is also very less, but that should be added in case patient is on parenteral nutrition for long time. Now coming to the question of vascular access, the location, the catheter type and site of the vein entry, we have to take into account. The factor which affect the anticipated duration of administration. If it is for the shorter duration, we prefer a peripheral line. If it is for a longer duration, we prefer a central venous catheter. And that also depends on the composition of fluid which we are giving or the nutrition we are giving. If it is high osmolality, we prefer a central line. If low osmolality, we can use even a peripheral line. Formulation diluted to avoid phlebitis, limit the total calories delivered, generally used for 6 days in patients who are not fluid restricted. Peripheral access, I am talking about peripheral access. And peripheral parenteral nutrition osmolality is less than 900 milliosmol per liter. Amino acid concentration is less than 5, and that of glucose is less than 10%. So these are the various vascular accesses. They have their advantages and disadvantages. From the peripheral line, chances of infections are more, and from the central line, chances of infection are less. If we are using subclavian line, then chances of pneumothorax are more, but the chances of infection are minimal. So these are various ways we can use the vascular access to deliver nutrition. So the rate of TPN infusion, glucose should not be more than 5 milligram per kg per minute. And we can give continuous parenteral diffusion or interrupted. So non-interrupted parenteral nutrition over 24 hours have certain advantages and disadvantages. Advantage is that it is well tolerated, less manipulation is required. Disadvantage is the persistent anabolic state. So there is altered insulin-glucagon ratio and increased lipid storage in the liver. This reduces the patient mobility also. Intermittent administration also has its advantages and disadvantages. Advantage is that approximately normal physiology, maintain nitrogen balance, reduce risk of hepatic steatosis, and ideal for ambulatory patient. And disadvantage is not well tolerated by critically ill patient, and more nursing manipulation is required. So this is the how to monitor. Now we have to monitor glucose level, basic metabolite panel, along with sodium, potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium. This is very important. Daily until advanced to goal means the goal, the nutrition which we want to give, and then 1 to 2 times per week. CBC baseline and then 1 to 2 times per week. Liver function test baseline, then weekly. Serum triglyceride baseline, if at risk, then as and when needed. Iron studies, zinc, copper, selenium, and magnesium, they are not required in the routine and can be repeated after some time. So what are the complications and management? There are certain acute complications, especially when accessing the vessel. There may be hyperglycemia and refeeding syndrome. So I will try to confine myself only to these complications, but there are thromboembolic complications, liver disease also, metabolic bone disease, and nephropathy. Refeeding syndrome is a life-threatening condition defined as a potentially fatal shift in fluid and electrolyte resulting from hormonal and metabolic changes that may occur in malnourished patients receiving nutritional therapy. Can be seen in both oral, enteral, and parenteral nutrition. And there is a criteria, nice criteria for assessing the risk of refeeding syndrome. If any one or more of the following, like BMI less than 16, unintentional weight loss of more than 15% in previous 3 to 6 months, little or no nutrition for more than 10 days, and low risk of potassium, phosphorus, or manganese before refeeding, low levels. If they have their levels are low, then they are at risk. If only one is present, and if 2 or more of the following, like BMI less than 18.5, unintentional weight loss of more than 10%, little or no nutrition for 5 days, history of alcohol abuse, drug, including insulin, chemotherapy, antacid, or diuretic. So once we identify this patient, we have to be extra careful. So how we start, we check potassium, phosphate, magnesium level before starting and giving correction. Before feeding, give IV thiamine and other vitamin supplementation to maintain supplementation for 10 days minimum. Then if there is moderate risk, 50% of energy need in first 48 hours. If high risk, 10 calories per kg per day, and we can increase it slowly over 4 to 7 days. And if extremely high risk, we give 5 calories per kg per day under continuous cardiac monitoring. And we monitor fluid balance, blood pressure, heart rate, electrolyte, and glycemia regularly. Now coming to hyperglycemia. Prevalence which is reported is around 30% on enteral nutrition, 50% on parenteral nutrition, and independently associated with high rate of mortality, septicemia, cardiac complication, and renal failure. Increased hepatic glucose production and peripheral insulin resistance is common in even when we are giving intravenous glucose. This has not been utilized due to resistance to insulin in ICU patients. So how we manage? We guideline recommend that dose should be in the range of 140 to 180. So permissive hyperglycemia is the basis on which we give or we give insulin. We don't try to maintain it too tightly. Parenteral nutrition with a lower glucose load compared with high glucose load had decreased incidence of hyperglycemia and improved mortality in ICU patients. If a moderate dose of insulin is required, then a portion of this is typically added to the parenteral nutrition formulation, and continuous infusion insulin infusion preferred over sliding scale for better control. Now, complication of access, peripherally placed catheter have the lowest risk of complication compared with CVC placement, but CVC placement results in pneumothorax, arterial puncture, and line malposition approximately 1 to 4%.
Sir, Dr. Saraya, we
Yes.
are running short of time. If you
Okay,
don't
and
mind.
I can go through infections. We can control parenteral nutrition. Now coming to what are the parenteral nutrition associated liver diseases? We see steatosis, cholestasis, and gallbladder sludge and stone. Steatosis and other things, steatosis is seen only in adults due to overfeeding, and presentation is mild to moderately elevated enzymes. This is a benign condition. Cholestasis is seen in children and adults receiving long-term parenteral nutrition, and gallbladder sludge and stone is also seen in children and adults due to lack of enteral stimulation. So this is also a typically benign condition, and these are the interventions which are needed for avoiding this. Prevent excess calorie administration, appropriate ratio of dextrose to fat, introducing oral or enteral nutrition, and cycle infusion is better than the continuous infusion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any questions? Yes, Dr. Jayendra.
Good evening, sir. So once the patient develops refeeding syndrome and we have hypophosphatemia, hypomagnesemia, hypokalemia, what should be the guide to management to this? I mean, IV replacement followed by oral, how it has to be stepped
Yes,
according to the patient?
First, you have to give very less calories in the beginning. That I have already told you, that the requirement should be that has also been shown in the slide, how much to give in the beginning. And we can give these supplements because you see, phosphate is very important for ATP generation. So if that is not there, and then that is also required for even for the normal function of the ATP. If it is not there, then what will happen? There may be respiratory muscle paralysis, or there may be less excursion of diaphragm. So that's a very serious condition. So we avoid giving too much of calories, and we give supplements, and we have to withdraw to excess calorie. That is the mainstay of the therapy. And in case there is other deficiencies, we supplement all those vitamins and the micronutrients which are deficient. And very close monitoring.
Good evening, sir. Sir, what are your experiences with the cholecystokinin infusion? And if it's not available, then what are the alternatives?
Sir,
to cholecystokinin infusion, sir. to
actually
reduce the chances of gallbladder stones?
not using this routinely, and I don't have any experience dealing with it. And there is, I think, no good trial also available in the literature on this particular issue. This has not been addressed in any of the guidelines, whether it is ESPN guidelines or ASPEN guideline, that is American Society of Parenteral and Parenteral Nutrition. This issue somehow has not been addressed. And only, I think, cholecystokinin that acts as actually the role is in stimulating gallbladder so that the trophic effect of bile salts, that is also there on the intestine. And these hormones, especially cholecystokinin or gastrin, or for that matter, other hormones, they act on the gut and they restore the barrier function to some extent. So they prevent atrophy of gut. That is the role of even the enteral nutrition initially, because we give trophic nutrition. So trophic nutrition also serves the same purpose. Trophic nutrition, that means we give very little calorie, even 10 ml or 10 calorie per hour is enough to prevent gastric atrophy, gut atrophy. That is also very important. That is why we say that trophic feed is needed in ICU patient to prevent transmigration of gut bacteria and endotoxin. So that is the only role, in fact, and especially in acalculous, to prevent acalculous cholecystitis, or for that matter, biliary sludge formation, because cholecystokinin can stimulate gallbladder. So those things can be taken care of with cholecystokinin. But I have not gone through any large series where they have used cholecystokinin for combating these complications.
So what is your opinion about glutamine, sir?
Glutamine, you see, glutamine, again, glutamine is needed for the restoration of gut function. And so glutamine is also, in fact, especially after severe sepsis and especially in burn patient, there are studies where they have shown that glutamine is effective. But we have tried in severe acute pancreatitis, and we have given oral glutamine, and oral glutamine was not found to be very effective. In fact, that was a negative study reported by us. And there are meta-analysis also, and glutamine has shown some beneficial effect when given intravenously. But in burn cases, yes, they have shown in a meta-analysis also. There are 3 or 4 randomized trial, and the meta-analysis of those trials have shown that it can be effective. It can be added, but no recommendation can be given at this stage for use of glutamine in patients, in ICU patients.
Thank you, sir. I think that was
can I just add one point here? I would just, sir, in critically ill patients and mechanical ventilation, when we start the TPN, there is an increased production of carbon dioxide. There is an increased requirement for increased minute ventilation. In addition, with a lot of lipid component in the TPN, there is 1 to 2% drop in the saturation also. Do you see that all?
Yes. Especially if you are giving continuous infusion, and that too with lot of lipid emulsions, then in that case they clog the vessels and they increase the edema also, especially in pulmonary care ICU. That we have also observed.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk and a wonderful discussion after that. Now I request Dr. Jain to introduce the third speaker.
It's a great